Hi, everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're joining us today because we are tackling one of the absolute most fascinating intellectual puzzles out there. We are diving into the ultimate demarcation line. Think about it. Every single day, we're bombarded with claims. Some are rock-solid science, while others, well, they're just pseudoscience wearing a lab coat. But what exactly is the fundamental challenge in defining what constitutes real science? How do we actually draw that line? Well, today we're going to unpack the incredible history and the philosophy behind that exact question. So, how do we separate real science from clever illusions? I mean, it sounds simple enough, right? You'd think if it has data, it's science. If it doesn't, it's not. But as we're going to see, this boundary, what philosophers call the demarcation problem, is actually incredibly blurry. It's like a giant puzzle. We're going to explore this intellectual mystery together. And I promise you, by the end of this explainer, you're going to look at scientific claims in a totally different way. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to hit the demarcation problem, Karl Popper's bold idea, the falsifiability test, cracks in the criterion, and wrap it all up with a two-dimensional solution. Let's jump right into Section 1, the demarcation problem, the historical puzzle. You see, this isn't just some modern issue born in the internet age. People have been wrestling with this for millennia. Let's rewind all the way back to the 5th century BC. The Greek physician Hippocrates wrote a text about epilepsy, which, back then, everybody called the sacred disease. Hippocrates desperately wanted to separate his physiological, medical theory about the disease from the wild claims of magicians and faith healers, who basically just blamed it on the gods. He had to draw a line in the sand to establish real authority, and honestly, this was one of humanity's earliest recorded attempts at demarcation. He was literally trying to kick the charlatans out of the medical tent. Moving right along to Section 2, Karl Popper's bold idea, the risky bet. Fast forward with me to early 20th century Vienna. The city is just buzzing with revolutionary ideas. And there's this philosopher, Karl Popper, who's watching a massive clash of intellectual titans. On one hand, he's looking at Albert Einstein's theories of physics. On the other hand, he's looking at the psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud and the historical theories of Karl Marx. And Popper notices something really interesting. Freud and Marx had these incredibly flexible frameworks. It didn't matter what human behavior or economic event happened, their followers could perfectly explain it, but only in hindsight. Their theories just adapted to fit any data. But Einstein was making what Popper called a risky bet. He was making highly specific predictions about the physical universe that could easily be disproven. If his predictions were wrong, boom, his entire theory would collapse. Which brings us to Section 3, the falsifiability test. A strict standard. So, Popper realized something crucial. Being able to prove a theory right just isn't enough. Why? Because a clever theorist can find proof literally everywhere. He needed a much stricter standard. And that brings us to the core intellectual takeaway for you today, falsifiability. Popper declared that the true criterion for a scientific theory is its capacity to be proven wrong through rigorous testing. Basically, if there is no conceivable experiment or observation that could possibly shatter your theory, well, you aren't really doing science. You're doing something else. A real scientific theory has to stick its neck out. Okay, so here is the ultimate example of a risky bet in action. May 29, 1919. A British expedition led by astronomers Arthur Eddington and Frank Dyson sets out to test Einstein's theory of general relativity during a solar eclipse. Now, Einstein's theory predicted that the gravity of a massive object, like the sun, would actually bend the starlight traveling right past it. Eddington and Dyson measured the light, and guess what? It bent exactly as Einstein predicted. It was a monumental, dangerous prediction. It could have entirely destroyed Einstein's theory right then and there if the light hadn't bent. But because it was so highly falsifiable, yet actually survived the test, Popper viewed this as the absolute gold standard of real science. But of course, things get messy. Section 4, cracks in the criterion, the real world's complication. Falsifiability sounds like a totally perfect solution, right? It gives us this clean, sharp line. But let's think about the real world for a second. Let's say you're testing a brilliant theory and your experiment just totally fails. Did you just scientifically disprove the theory? Or, is your equipment just broken? In the real world, laboratories are messy, instruments fail, conditions are almost never perfect. Case in point. Right after that triumphant 1919 solar eclipse test we just talked about, observatories out in California attempted to replicate those exact same results, and they failed completely. Now, if we strictly follow falsifiability, they should have thrown Einstein's theory of general relativity right into the trash bin. But obviously, that would have been a massive disaster. It turned out the California observatories just had faulty conditions for their tests. So this clearly shows us that rejecting a massive scientific theory based on a single failed test is actually incredibly dangerous. And these real-world complications, they didn't just stay in the laboratory. They completely spilled over into the legal system. American courts really struggled with this philosophical line. Just look at how this evolved over time. Back in the famous 1925 Scopes monkey trial, the battle over teaching evolution began. By 1982 in McLean Barn, Arkansas, Judge William Overton actually used Karl Popper's falsifiability test in his ruling to separate science from creationism. But science and our understanding of it isn't static. By the time we hit the 2005 Kitzmiller v. Dover trial regarding intelligent design, Judge John E. Jones III actually had to abandon Popper's strict one-dimensional rule. The courts realized the legal system needed a much more nuanced, updated approach to define what science actually is. So why did the courts eventually move away from Popper? Well, philosopher Larry Ladon pointed out a hilarious but absolutely critical flaw in 1983. He said, look, if falsifiability is the only rule, then as long as you make a claim that can be tested and disproven, you're technically being scientific. And that means flat earthers, Loch Ness monster hunters, or Goenbox supporters, astrologers, and people trying to build perpetual motion machines, they're all accidentally validated as practitioners of science, simply because their bizarre claims can be tested. Obviously, drawing a single rigid line of demarcation just wasn't cutting it anymore. So what's the fix? Section 5. A two-dimensional solution. Mapping the landscape. It was time for philosophy to ditch the simple, one-dimensional line and map out a much more accurate landscape of human knowledge. Enter philosopher Massimo Pigliucci. Instead of a simple pass/fail line, he proposed a two-dimensional landscape. Think of it like this. On the vertical axes, you've got empirical knowledge, basically how much hard, observable data something actually has. Then, on the horizontal axis, you have theoretical understanding, which is how deep and logically sound the underlying theory actually is. Suddenly, the line of demarcation bends into this really complex, fascinating territory. To really ground this, let's picture where things sit on this map. Way up in the top right corner, that's high theory and high empirical knowledge, you find your robust sciences, things like evolutionary biology and particle physics. They have huge amounts of data and incredibly strong theoretical frameworks. But if you look down in the bottom left, low theory and low empirical knowledge, that's where you find things like astrology and intelligent design. They completely lack both deep explanatory power and physical proof. By mapping it out like this, we can clearly see the whole spectrum of knowledge without accidentally giving a scientific stamp of approval to the Loch Ness monster. But as we wrap up today, we really have to remember one last absolutely crucial point. Science is, by its very nature, dynamic. Even within real, rigorous science, facts are constantly evolving based on new evidence. Just look at these shifts. If you went to school before 2006, you were absolutely taught that Pluto was a planet. Now, it's a dwarf planet. If you loved dinosaurs as a kid, you definitely pictured them as these giant bearskin reptiles. Now, the scientific consensus points to many of them being feather-covered ancestors of modern birds. Discarding old theories when new evidence arrives isn't a failure of science, guys. It is literally the exact mechanism of how science works. It's a beautifully self-correcting process. So, I want to leave you with this provocative final thought. If the line of science is always moving, always updating and refining itself, what facts that we hold absolutely true today will become the outdated science, or maybe even the pseudoscience, of tomorrow? It's a great reminder to stay curious, stay completely open to new evidence, and to always keep questioning the world around you. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.
Hey everyone, and welcome to today's explainer. We are diving right into a seriously fascinating journey today, looking at the historical evolution of fringe beliefs. You know, we hear the word pseudoscience thrown around a lot these days, right? Usually it's used as an insult, just to dismiss someone else's ideas. But what actually makes a science fake? Is it the methods they use, the people doing it, or is it something else entirely? Today, we're going to unpack the underlying structure of these alternative systems of knowledge. And honestly, you might be surprised by how closely they mirror the exact same scientific establishment they're often fighting against.
So right off the bat, we run into this one incredibly stubborn question. How do we actually separate scientific fact from fiction? And this isn't just some modern headache we're dealing with today. It's what philosophers call the Demarcation Problem. It's literally the timeless philosophical struggle to draw a clear, sharp line between real science and fake science. And as we're going to see, finding a universal rule that perfectly separates the two, well, it's been an incredibly stubborn puzzle throughout all of human history.
All right, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the demarcation problem. Second, defunct sciences. Third, anti-establishment sciences. And fourth, mind-power sciences.
Okay, part 1, the demarcation problem.
You know, this boundary battle over what counts as science is actually ancient. Take the Hippocratic text on the sacred disease, from way back in the 5th century BC, which discussed epilepsy. Early Greek physicians were actively trying to distance themselves from magicians and faith healers. Why? Well, because to establish their own credibility, they had to explicitly define what was not legitimate medicine. Excluding the opposition to claim scientific authority is a tactic that has literally been used for thousands of years.
Fast forward to the 20th century, and we meet the philosopher Karl Popper. He came up with the most famous solution to our problem, the theory of falsifiability. Popper essentially compared Albert Einstein's physics, which made incredibly risky, testable predictions, like exactly how starlight would bend during a 1919 solar eclipse, with Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis. Popper argued that true science takes risks and, most importantly, can be proven wrong. Unfalsifiable science, on the other hand, is so flexible that it can just explain away any conflicting data.
So the crucial takeaway here is this. If a theory is perfectly flexible, it just can't be disproven. But philosophers pretty quickly realized Popper's standard isn't exactly flawless. I mean, even rigorous, mainstream science sometimes struggles to be flawlessly tested. Just think about evolutionary biology or geology, where we can't exactly rewind time in a lab, right? And conversely, some fake sciences actually do make testable claims that can be proven wrong. So the line is still just a bit blurry.
Moving on to part 2, defunct sciences.
It's kind of wild to think about, but historically speaking, astrology in the 2nd century with Ptolemy and alchemy in the 15th century weren't fringe theories at all. They were the mainstream disciplines. Princes and royalty heavily funded them right up until the scientific revolution. They only became defunct when the 18th century shift toward modern chemistry and astronomy pushed them out of the acceptable scientific consensus.
So why did alchemy ultimately get the boot? Well, it leaned heavily on highly secretive codes and symbols. They would translate the images of snakes and birds into chemical steps. It fundamentally lacked a transparent, shared methodology. So when the new scientific era came along and demanded open publication and replicable experiments, alchemy was cast out and officially reclassified as a defunct pseudoscience.
All right, part 3, anti-establishment sciences.
Now, when we look at modern anti-establishment movements, like ufology or flat earth theories, we find a completely different core belief at play, that the scientific establishment is actively hiding the truth. Unlike those defunct sciences that just sort of aged out of relevance, anti-establishment sciences operate on the assumption of a massive, deliberate cover-up. They view themselves as the true objective researchers who are bravely fighting against a dogmatic scientific elite.
And hey, if you're sitting there thinking these ideas are purely marginal, consider this. According to a 2018 survey, an unbelievable 1 in 6 Americans were not entirely convinced that the Earth is round. Let that sink in. This proves we're talking about a highly relevant, deeply embedded modern movement here, not just some medieval throwback. In fact, the whole idea of a flat Earth is a surprisingly modern controversy.
The azimuthal projection map used by flat Earth advocates actually centers directly on the North Pole. What's really fascinating here is how they utilize complex visual models and terminology to closely parallel mainstream cartography. They are literally mimicking the visual language of science to legitimize their anti-establishment claims.
A really crucial, kind of mind-bending detail of this alternative map is the outer rim. In their model, the South Pole isn't a continent at all. Instead, it's believed to be a massive outer ice wall holding all the oceans in place. It's actually a remarkably detailed countermodel that completely answers the internal logic of their belief system.
Which brings us to part 4, mind-power sciences.
There is such a fascinating direct lineage of belief going on here. We start way back with 18th century mesmerism, which was known as animal magnetism. As that started to fade, its remnants evolved directly into the Victorian seances of spiritualism. And ultimately, by the time we hit the 20th century, that intense desire to map the unseen human mind transformed into university-level extrasensory perception, or ESP research. It's a very clear, direct chain of evolving belief.
Now, this might surprise you, but spiritualists? They didn't see themselves as anti-science at all. Sparked in 1848 by the Fox sisters up in New York, mediums were seen as actual physical transmitters between worlds. They eagerly embraced brand new technologies, like photography, to try and capture objective empirical proof. They even attracted elite, incredibly prominent chemists like William Crookes to investigate their claims under strict observation. They actively wanted scientific validation.
Ultimately, a botanist-turned-psychologist named J.B. Rhine completely shifted the landscape in the 1920s. He moved this research entirely out of the dark seance rooms and straight into the bright university psychology labs. The movement shed its magical, spiritual roots completely. By adopting standard experimental psychology methods, statistics, and highly controlled trials, ESP researchers attempted to gain strict, unquestionable academic legitimacy.
Finally, we reach our last section, the unavoidable shadow.
So, what's the big sociological realization we need to take away from all this? Well, it's that pseudoscience is basically an unavoidable byproduct of science's competitive, ever-evolving nature. The scientific method is a brutal battleground of ideas. It naturally produces winners and losers. But here's the thing, the people behind the discarded ideas often don't just give up and go home. Those losing ideas persist, they evolve, and they are eventually labeled as pseudoscience by whatever the current consensus happens to be.
Which leads us to this honestly pretty powerful metaphor. Pseudoscience is the unavoidable shadow of scientific progress. You simply cannot have the bright light of mainstream science without casting a shadow. As our knowledge grows and the light shifts, that shadow changes its shape, morphing from alchemy to flat earth to mind powers, but the shadow never ever disappears entirely. It is a completely inherent part of the system. I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to chew on today. If what we've learned today holds true, and pseudoscience is truly just the shadow of scientific progress, what current, rock-solid scientific consensus that we teach in schools today is going to be labeled a defunct pseudoscience in 100 years? It's definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the anatomy of manipulated science. You know, we usually think of science as this pure, untouched pursuit of absolute truth, right? But what happens when that pursuit gets hijacked by powerful interests? Well, understanding the history of how science gets manipulated completely changes how you look at the information you consume today. We're going to dig into the historical record and see exactly how objective facts have been twisted, suppressed, or totally weaponized to serve agendas that honestly have absolutely nothing to do with scientific discovery. So I want you to really think about this for a second. What actually happens when science becomes a political weapon? Just imagine living in a reality where the fundamental laws of physics or the basic principles of biology aren't determined by experience or peer review. No, instead, they're dictated by a dictator's decree or maybe a corporate boardroom's profit margins. According to the sources we're looking at today, this isn't just some dystopian sci-fi movie. It's a repeated historical reality. When objective truth is systematically swapped out for an agenda, the consequences for society, our health, and human progress are, well, they're incredibly profound. All right, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover science under threat, Aryan physics in Germany, Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union, manufacturing doubt and denial, and finally, climate wars and manufactured doubt. Let's get right into it. Starting us off with Section 1, Science Under Threat. Looking back at the early to mid-20th century, totalitarian governments started to realize something pretty terrifying. Controlling the scientific narrative was just as important as controlling the military or the press. They literally used brute force to ensure scientific consensus aligned perfectly with their political ideologies. Our sources call this specific phenomenon hyper-politicized science. Now, let's be clear for a second. All science has some level of politics, right? Governments fund research, politicians use data for policy, that's normal. But hyper-politicized science, that is a whole different beast. It's when the scientific method itself is structurally hijacked. It's when an ideology decides what the truth must be before any experiments are done, and then uses state power, censorship, and even imprisonment to force scientists to agree. They literally just ignore the actual evidence. Moving on to Section 2, Aryan Physics in Germany. When the Third Reich came to power, they wanted to align literally every aspect of human knowledge with their racial ideology. And that led to a movement inside the scientific community explicitly called Aryan Physics. It's kind of wild to think about, right? Dividing the laws of nature by race. Two Nobel laureates, Philipp Leonard and Johannes Stark, actually led the charge here. They argued that true science was rooted in the German national spirit, and they championed older classical physics. On the flip side, they branded the groundbreaking work of Albert Einstein, specifically his theories of relativity and quantum mechanics, as Jewish physics. Just because his work relied on abstract math, and because Einstein himself was Jewish and a pacifist, they declared his universally applicable theories entirely invalid and tried to erase them from German education. Now, the real-world consequences of this ideological purity test were absolutely catastrophic for Germany. In 1933, they passed the Civil Service Law, which systematically kicked Jewish and socialist scientists out of their academic and civil jobs. The state was literally dictating scientific truth based on race instead of, actual experimentation. And what happened? A massive brain drain. Some of the greatest scientific minds in history just packed up and fled Germany. A lot of them headed to the US and the UK, which, ironically enough, ended up severely damaging Germany's own scientific and military progress in the long run. That brings us to Section 3, Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union. Right around that same time, over in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, a totally different branch of science was being manipulated for absolute control. This wasn't physics, and it wasn't about racial ideology. But the mechanics of this hyper-politicization were incredibly similar. Enter Trofim Lysenko. Now, Lysenko wasn't some highly educated academic. He was actually an agricultural worker from Ukraine. But in 1927, he got praised in the state newspaper for a technique he used for planting peas. From that super modest start, he managed to play the Soviet political system to an astonishing degree. Fast forward to 1948, he gets the official backing of Joseph Stalin himself, and Lysenko basically becomes the absolute, unquestioned dictator of Soviet biology. And he didn't lose his grip on power until 1965, well after Stalin died. So what exactly was Lysenkoism anyway? Basically, Lysenko claimed you could fundamentally change a plant's genetics just by exposing it to environmental stress, like freezing cold weather, and then those brand new traits would just pass down to the next generation. It was an idea that perfectly fit the Marxist ideology of environmental conditioning. The problem? It completely contradicted globally accepted classical genetics. The proven science of Mendel and Morgan that showed genes are immutable units. But the Soviet state literally outlawed classical genetics entirely, calling it a corrupt bourgeois science. Crazy, right? I really want you to put yourself in the shoes of a legitimate biologist sitting in a crowded conference hall in 1948. A massive debate has been raging between real geneticists and Lysenko's loyal followers. And then, Lysenko stands up and reads this exact quote. "The Central Committee of the party has examined my report and approved it." Boom. With that single sentence, the debate was just over. Scientific consensus was officially replaced by political decree right then and there. The real geneticists in the room were immediately fired, and the entire field of biology in the USSR was basically crippled for decades. All right, on to Section 4, Manufacturing Doubt and Denial. So as those authoritarian regimes fell or shifted after World War II, the blatant state-enforced hijacking of science kind of faded out. But the manipulation of science? Oh, it definitely didn't disappear. It just evolved. It moved away from the blunt instrument of state coercion and stepped right into the slick, incredibly well-funded world of corporate public relations. Now, it's worth noting that anti-establishment movements pushing back on scientific consensus, they aren't brand new. You can see early examples of grassroots resistance from over a century ago. But our sources highlight a massive shift starting in the 1950s. That's when these scattered sentiments were organized, weaponized, and pumped full of cash by powerful corporate interests simply trying to protect their bottom line. And guys, here is the absolute smoking gun of that era. Doubt is our product. That is a direct quote. It's from an internal memo outlining the tobacco industry's public relations strategy. See, in the 1950s, the scientific consensus was getting really solid that smoking caused cancer. The tobacco industry knew they couldn't actually prove smoking was safe. The science was just too clear on that. So they completely shifted their goal. They realized they didn't actually need to win the scientific argument, they just needed to manufacture enough doubt in the public's mind to keep people buying cigarettes and to keep the government regulators off their backs. To pull this off, PR firms devised this highly effective, deeply insidious three-step playbook. Step 1. Create alternative, industry-funded think tanks that look exactly like legitimate scientific institutions. Very sneaky. Step 2. Constantly demand more research. By insisting the science is never quite settled, they successfully feigned an ongoing scientific debate, where among actual experts, none existed. And Step 3. Use that manufactured uncertainty to delay government regulation indefinitely. And honestly, it worked flawlessly for decades. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Climate Wars and Manufactured Doubt. So that exact same corporate playbook we just talked about, it was seamlessly copy-pasted into one of the most critical scientific discussions of our time, the climate wars. The fossil fuel industry literally took the tobacco industry's tactics to manufacture doubt about global warming. By the 1980s, the scientific consensus on CO2 emissions and planetary warming was becoming crystal clear. And the wildest part? Internal documents show the fossil fuel companies understood these climate risks perfectly well. But using the exact same PR firms and sometimes literally the exact same experts who defended tobacco, they went after the consensus. They funded think tanks to muddy the waters, weaponizing scientific skepticism not to find the truth, but to protect corporate profits. And exactly like tobacco, they successfully delayed crucial environmental action for years. I think this comparison brilliantly sums up the whole journey we've taken today. Just look at the difference here. On one side, you've got state politicization from the 30s to the 50s. It's driven by ideological purity, relying on brute force and censorship. That's your Aryan physics and Lysenkoism. Then on the other side, you have modern corporate denialism, driven by profits, relying on PR campaigns, fake think tanks, and lobbying, like the tobacco and climate change denial movements we just covered. It's the exact same hijacking of science, but it evolved from the blunt instruments of dictators to the super sophisticated, well-funded deception of modern corporations. So the absolute crucial takeaway here is this. Whenever you hear a pundit or an industry spokesperson on TV demanding more research before we take action, you really have to look closely at their motives. Don't get me wrong, in genuine science, more research is fantastic. It's how we learn. But in the denial playbook we've been outlining today, the phrase, "we need more research," is totally weaponized. It's a calculated, deliberate ploy designed to freeze action, stall regulation, and maintain the status quo. It is not about uncovering the truth. Which leaves us with one final thought to ponder. The next time you turn on the news or scroll through your feed and you see this fierce scientific debate over a public health crisis or an environmental policy, how are you going to evaluate it? Are you witnessing the rigorous, peer-reviewed pursuit of truth? Or are you watching a well-funded PR strategy designed to manufacture doubt and protect an agenda? Well, armed with this historical context, you've now got the tools to spot the difference. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Stay curious out there and definitely keep questioning what you see. Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and completely shatter the illusion of the perfect, objective scientific machine. You know, when we look back at the history of human knowledge, especially over the last 100 years or so, it's absolutely undeniable that our understanding of the universe has just grown exponentially. But how exactly does that knowledge actually get produced? We usually picture this pristine, quiet laboratory, right? A lone genius having a sudden eureka moment, followed by immediate universal agreement on the facts from everyone else. Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain and look at the actual, highly human and sometimes incredibly chaotic process of how science really gets done. We naturally just assume that scientific discovery is this calm, methodical march straight toward the truth. But I really want you to ask yourself if that's actually the whole story. I mean, we're taught in school that scientists propose hypotheses, test them rigorously, and if the data doesn't hold up, well, they simply throw the idea away and move on to the next one. It sounds incredibly rational, doesn't it? But here's the thing. Scientists are human beings. They are driven by curiosity for sure, but they're also driven by ambition, pride, and the very real everyday need to keep their jobs and secure funding. And there is a massive, massive gap between that idealized view of science and the highly competitive,
rushed reality where controversy actually isn't a bug, it's a core part of the system. In the modern era, a scientist builds a reputation not just by double-checking known facts, but by discovering something completely brand new. And this competitive framework, it creates a huge landscape of winners and losers. If you just confirm someone else's work, you're not getting the Nobel Prize. To get those big grants, to secure a prestigious university position, and to get published in top-tier journals, you literally have to be first. And when the stakes are that high, well, things can get very, very messy.
So let's start our little detective story here with polywater. This was a discovery that seemed to completely rewrite the laws of physics and, understandably, caused massive excitement. Just imagine you're a chemist and someone comes up to you and says they found a completely new form of water. It has the exact same chemical structure, H2O, but its properties are totally mind-bending. They're telling you it's 20 to 40% denser than normal water. It boils at a staggering 250 degrees Celsius, freezes way below zero, and it's incredibly thick, almost like a heavy syrup. Crazy, right? Now, if we trace the rapid rise of this amazing discovery, you'll see just how suddenly and completely it collapsed by 1973. It originally started back in the mid-1960s over in the Soviet Union, and for a few years, it was this closely guarded curiosity. But then, in 1966, a leading Soviet researcher presented these findings at a Faraday Society meeting over in Nottingham, England. The West caught wind of it, and boom, an absolute scientific gold rush began. By the late 60s and early 70s, researchers in leading nations were pouring massive resources into studying this bizarre syrupy substance.
So, what was the actual verdict? Well, this wasn't fraud. It was an honest, everyday laboratory mistake caused by contaminated water samples. A mistake that the scientific method eventually managed to correct. You see, by 1973, independent teams finally proved that this supposed miracle water was literally just regular water contaminated with tiny amounts of sweat, glass particles, and other random impurities from the lab equipment. The original researchers weren't trying to trick anyone. They were genuinely misinterpreting flawed experimental data. It's actually a perfect example of a scientific controversy resolving itself naturally through rigorous testing. But man, it took years of really heated debate to finally get there. Which brings us right into our next section, escalating the stakes, the cold fusion scandal. So what happens when the intense pressure for glory and funding pushes scientists to completely abandon standard procedures? In 1989, two chemists, Stanley Pons and Martin Fleischmann, claimed to have achieved nuclear fusion at room temperature using a surprisingly simple desktop setup. Now, nuclear fusion is literally the process that powers the stars. Normally, doing this requires massive magnetic containment fields and temperatures so unbelievably high they would melt any physical container on Earth. But Pons and Fleischmann, they claimed they achieved it in a little glass jar on a standard laboratory bench in Utah, using a palladium electrode and heavy water. They said the palladium was forcing deuterium ions so close together that they just fused, releasing massive amounts of energy. Infinite, clean energy from water. I mean, it was the absolute holy grail of physics. But here's where it goes off the rails. To beat a rival, they bypassed peer review entirely, went straight to the public with a massive press event, and triggered an absolute global media frenzy. They knew another researcher nearby, Stephen E. Jones, was working on something very similar. Terrified of losing the credit, the patents, and the frankly unimaginable financial windfall, Pons, Fleischmann, and the University of Utah held this huge press conference on March 23, 1989, before their paper had even been thoroughly vetted by other scientists. They completely short-circuited the normal peer review process. To give you a sense of the utter chaos this caused, the price of palladium, which was the key metal used in their experiment, skyrocketed to $170 an ounce almost overnight. Before the big announcement, it was trading around $145. Suddenly, every single lab in the world, and honestly every investor too, wanted in. Scientists were desperately trying to replicate the experiment based on grainy, faxed photos and television news clips because the actual technical paper wasn't even available yet. The whole world was just absolutely captivated by the promise of cheap, limitless energy. But the crash was inevitable. Because the promised radiation and heat couldn't be reproduced by independent labs, the scientific community rapidly tore the claims apart, pushing cold fusion to the fringes forever. Think about it. When you claim to have created nuclear fusion, physicists expect to see very specific byproducts, like neutrons and massive amounts of heat. But when other labs finally got their hands on the actual details and ran the tests properly, they found absolutely nothing. At a major physics meeting in May 1989, the claims were systematically dismantled. Pons and Fleischmann were essentially exiled from mainstream science, eventually moving their lab to France in 1992 before just sort of fading into obscurity. And that naturally leads us to our final section, the modern era cracks in the system. Let's take a look. While polywater and cold fusion were these massive, highly public controversies, today we're dealing with something much, much more insidious. The fundamental structure of how we reward scientists has created a perfect breeding ground for bad data. But we really need to clearly separate rare, outright fraud from the much more pervasive and dangerous replication crisis. Yes, outright fraud definitely happens. We saw it back in 2002 when physicist Jan Hendrik Schoen was caught completely faking data on semiconductors at Bell Labs. And again in 2006 when Huang Woo-suk fabricated results about cloning human stem cells. These are headline-grabbing, terrible betrayals. But honestly, the bigger problem isn't those rare liars, it's the systemic failure where well-meaning researchers are producing results that simply cannot be reproduced by anyone else. Prepare yourselves for a massive data shock here. In 2015, when researchers tried to replicate 100 landmark psychology studies, only 36% actually succeeded. Just think about that for a second. These were prominent, peer-reviewed studies published in top-tier journals. A massive initiative called the Reproducibility Project carefully reran all these experiments, and almost 2/3 of them completely failed to produce the original results. What we thought were foundational, rock-solid facts of human psychology turned out to be nothing more than statistical mirages. And guys, it gets even scarier in medicine. Out of 53 landmark cancer studies, the company Amgen successfully replicated exactly 6. That is just over 11%. When we are talking about cancer research, we're literally talking about life and death, not to mention billions of dollars in drug development. If the foundational research is fundamentally flawed, the entire house of cards collapses. So this isn't just some abstract academic problem. It has massive, undeniable, real-world consequences for all of us. So why is this happening? Well, the fierce competition for limited funding heavily rewards flashy, novel results over careful, boring verification. Scientists are under immense pressure to rush the publication of their results and to just publish constantly. If they spend a whole year running an experiment and get a negative or a boring result, journals simply won't publish it. So there is this huge, often unconscious temptation to tweak the statistical software, exclude an inconvenient outlier data point here or there, and just massage the numbers until they show a significant breakthrough. And the traditional peer review system, it's simply overwhelmed by the sheer volume of publications and just isn't equipped to catch these subtle manipulations. So I want to leave you all with a somewhat provocative thought to ponder. Does this chaotic, fiercely competitive environment ruin science? Or is this messy, self-correcting struggle exactly what makes the pursuit of truth so powerful in the first place? Yes, researchers make honest mistakes like polywater. Yes, blind ambition can lead to spectacular implosions like cold fusion. And yes, the intense pressure to publish has created a massive replication crisis. But notice what happens every single time. Other scientists catch it. The system is fundamentally designed to be adversarial. It relies on rivals actively trying to prove each other wrong. It's certainly not a flawless machine, but it is a relentless one. And maybe, just maybe, that fierce, incredibly messy competition is the only real way to truly separate fact from fiction. Keep questioning everything, keep learning, and I'll catch you guys next time.